On the line, we have Dr. MarkAlain Dery. He is an infectious disease specialist out of New Orleans, Louisiana, and I wanted to bring him on the line today because Alabama has the, I believe it was the second highest COVID mortality rate, the second highest rate of death from COVID in the country. The only, thank God for Mississippi, as the saying goes. They are the only state in the country with a higher rate of death than Alabama from the coronavirus. We also have the third largest share of unvaccinated individuals in the state. So I know that we are on a conservative talk radio station, and we have a lot of listeners who do not trust the vaccine, and I wanted to bring Dr. Dery on to be as unjudgmental and to be as fact-oriented, and just we want to level with everybody and bring you some good information and some good places to do more reading if you're not satisfied with our conversation here on the radio today. I know that lots of our members are skeptical about the vaccine. I know people in my life that are skeptical about the vaccine, that are skeptical about COVID in general somehow still after almost 1 million people dead. So I wanted to talk to Dr. Dery about that, about some of these things. And you know, like I said, I solicited a few questions from my Facebook page, and I have probably the majority of my friends on Facebook. People that I'm connected with are conservative people, are evangelicals, are people that, you know, that do not have the same political opinions as me. Very, very different, very different. So I solicited some questions from them. If you have any questions, or if you have heard any questions from vaccine skeptical people, then drop them in the YouTube or the Facebook chat. This is something that I hope we can clip this interview and you can share it with your members, and it will be helpful to them in you know, going through kind of these discussions about what's real and what's not real. Because to be fair to people on this radio station, I don't think I've ever heard anything about, oh, the vaccine is actually bad, but it's always kind of like, oh yeah, you should get the vaccine, sure, as a throwaway comment before they start attacking you know, Democrats and Dr. Fauci and things like this. It's always a throwaway comment. So I wanted to actually dive into, and I also wanted to kind of level out our coverage as well, because there are union members at ULA who have, I believe, reasonable medical exemptions that they're fighting for, and that their company is attempting to terminate them. There's a fellow with leukemia who has had COVID, who his doctor says he should probably not get the vaccine at this point, and the company is trying to fire him. In a workplace with a 97% vaccination rate, the company is trying to fire him. There's another fellow who's been going through chemotherapy for 6 months. He has cancer. His doctor also said you should probably not get the vaccine at this point. And the company's trying to fire him for that. So, you know, we have been on that. We've covered that story. And we've been sympathetic to the workers and antagonistic towards the boss. And so we don't want people to get the impression that we are anti-vaccine or that we're skeptical about the vaccine. We're very much pro-vaccine. We're very much pro-getting vaccinated and all of this thing. And so anyway, Dr. Dery, I very much appreciate you taking the time on this Saturday morning to talk to us about this. I think it's very important.
Thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So the first thing, I guess, can you talk to us, just generally speaking? I've got a couple more specific questions, but generally speaking, if you come to a vaccine skeptical individual, somebody that thinks that, you know, this is that it's bad, they shouldn't get it, it's going to hurt them, or it's going to be worse than COVID, what are like the first things, the first arguments that you say to these people to try to encourage them to get vaccinated?
So first, let me just be very clear that I have stopped doing that. I don't care anymore. I don't care anymore. It has been a year. There have been millions and millions and millions and millions of doses. Billions of people across this planet have been vaccinated. And if after a year, the first dose went in on December 19th. What's today's date? Today's date is December 18th. So it almost exactly 1 year ago today. And so, quite frankly, to be perfectly honest, I have stopped. I can't, like, I'm an infectious diseases doctor and epidemiologist. I have a very, very, very busy life and schedule, and I can't anymore individually, one by one, try to undo whatever misinformation that exists inside people's heads. So that's where I'm at right now. But let me answer your question. To be very clear, I try to approach it, or I used to, or if somebody does engage me, which again, I have stopped because, the conversations I had 9 months ago or 6 months ago are very different from the conversations I have now. Because 9 months ago or 6 months ago, people were still looking to possibly get vaccinated. We're at a point now with Omicron. This is probably 70 times more infectious than Delta. Delta was 120 times more infectious than Alpha, and Alpha was 50 times more infectious than the strain that emerged out of Wuhan. So we're not playing anymore. And the people who are getting sick from Omicron are those people who are either unvaccinated or those that are vaccinated but not yet boosted. So we're at a point now where we're at, like, I'm talking to people about getting booster doses, right? When do you get booster doses? You get booster doses after 6 months after your second mRNA vaccine. So like, we're talking about like 7 months out. And Omicron, wait for the tidal wave that is going to be Omicron. Omicron is going to, especially with Christmas and New Year's and the holidays, come mid-February, we are going to see a tsunami of cases moving forward. So what do I tell people? Billions of people have been vaccinated. This is incredibly safe. And very likely the studies are very, very clear that people who are the people who are not vaccinated are a predictor of those individuals who are unvaccinated is likely who they voted for in the recent election in 2020. Was it 2020? I can't even remember. Was it? Yeah, it was 2020. So if you voted for Trump and if you live in a county that voted for Trump, you have 5 times the likelihood of mortality. So you are 5 times more likely to die of coronavirus than if you live in a county that didn't vote for Trump. So this has clearly become politicized, and there's no reason for it to become politicized except for we are in a very, very, very dangerous time in our country's history. And we are deeply, deeply divided. And to be perfectly honest, the science is out there. Like you said, there's like a throwaway line and then attack Democrats and attack Dr. Fauci. So I'm like, I don't know what else to say. I'm done. I've spoke for 1 year. I've created cartoons. I have my own radio program. I am on TV. I got all 3 of my vaccinations live on television on the morning local morning news here in New Orleans. I have nothing left to say because I don't know what else there is to say. So there you go. That's the answer to your question.
Well, I got to say, Jacob, before you continue, that I appreciate you just being honest and keeping it real with us, because I can only imagine the frustration you feel as someone who is an expert in this area. You know, Jacob and I are not. And it's frustrating enough just on our end to have these conversations. So, appreciate you keeping it real. And not to digress it too much, but I just got to say, it is an interesting strategy to appear like you are killing off your own voting base.
It's incredibly like what this shows, and it's a great point, and I'm glad you brought it up, because I used to argue all the time, in medicine we put profits before people, and everybody used to get angry with me, and they'd be like, oh, don't politicize or don't do this, don't do that. But what this has shown, and what we've known now, because if you look at climate change, we haven't done anything for climate change. And if you look at gun violence, we haven't done anything about gun violence. And you look very, very closely what happened with the coronavirus pandemic. We haven't done anything. We have responded the worst this country has responded the worst. Public health science is pretty simple. It's very, very straightforward. And what we have shown is that our culture does not care for people. We do not care for people. We truly put profits in front of people. We put the profits of gun manufacturers. We put the profits of extractors of fossil fuels in front of people. And we put the profits of medicine in front of people. And you guys know more than anybody else, because this is a show that focuses on labor. You understand more than anybody else about how corporations and that put profits before people. So yes, this is an incredibly important point. And what this has shown is America does not care for people. So when they say that they are pro-life, that's not true. You are not pro-life. And you said that you're on a conservative radio station. So if I'm talking to people who are conservative, great. You are not pro-life. You are being fooled. This is not a pro-life thing, right? If you were pro-life, guns would be banned. If you were pro-life, we would figure out what to do in terms of climate change. And if you were truly pro-life, you and your family would all get vaccinated, because the people who are dying are people who are not vaccinated. And the people who are not vaccinated are people who voted for Trump, period.
Right. And that's, the death toll among unvaccinated people is something that is important to emphasize. And it's something that I share occasionally on my Facebook page, because like I said, I do have most of my family, people that I grew up with, they're all kind of conservative. Most of the people that I've been close with are, intelligent enough to have been vaccinated and things like this. But it's worth noting that in the last time that I did this was on November 21st, and at that point, 77% of Alabamians hospitalized with COVID-19 were unvaccinated. 77%, despite them only making up 45% of the population. And unvaccinated folks make up an even higher proportion of COVID-19 deaths. The latest information at that point showed that 90%, 9 out of 10 COVID deaths were among unvaccinated folks. And so, 9 out of 10, it seems to me, 9 out of 10 of these deaths that are happening every day among Alabamians, among people that I live and work and fellowship with, is they're dying needlessly, and that's very sad to me as a person that loves people, loves this community, loves the state, to see so many people dying needlessly. Where can people go? You mentioned that, you've been doing, and I've heard some of your interviews. You mentioned that you've been doing this kind of public health outreach for a year on these vaccines. Where can people go to find some of the more remedial type stuff, like, okay, help get them on board with getting vaccinated? Where would they go if they wanted to see what you were saying then?
Well, I mean, is the easy answer is just, stay away from conservative media and go to any mainstream media. And I am no fan of mainstream media. Mainstream media is just basically the marketing arm of corporate America. But right. I will say that mainstream media has gotten it right. So stay away from conservative media. But the animations that I was talking about, if you go to noisefiltershow.com, you'll see 2 cartoons. You'll see a bunch of animations, HIV, hepatitis C. But at the very bottom of the scroll, you'll see 2 animations that I created. One explaining how the mRNA vaccine works, and the second one explaining how variants emerge. So if you want to understand how Delta emerges or how Omicron emerges, you'll see that. And like I said, public health science is pretty straightforward. I wrote the scripts for those variants last February. In other words, I was it was fairly straightforward to predict that variants were going to emerge. So last February, we weren't talking about Alpha. We weren't talking about Delta. We weren't talking about Omicron, right? We were still talking about the variant that emerged out of Wuhan, right? We call that the wild type virus. So the wild type virus is what we were still talking about. But my co-creators, the people who made the cartoons with me, we all were able to predict. We're all public health workers. We were all able to predict that variants were going to emerge, and as a result of that, we wrote the variant script last February, and when I watch it now, almost a year later, I can't believe that how spot on we were a year ago. So NoiseFilterShow.com is the best place to go. But again, remember, mainstream media is basically the marketing arm of corporate America. So I have no love for mainstream media. I started a radio station here in New Orleans because I have no love for mainstream media. But that being said, they've gotten it right. So stay away from conservative media and focus on anything. Go to the CDC webpage, watch my cartoons. The vaccines are safe. The vaccines are good, and the vaccines will save your life and the life of your family.
And one of the things, and I believe it was one of your cartoons that you mentioned, and of course you can see this basically, like you said, everywhere, is that the mRNA vaccines, there's, among people I've heard there's a hesitance to get vaccinated because, we don't know what's going to happen 5 years out or 10 years out or whatever, a year out or, 2 years out. The mRNA vaccines in your video and in other places, it shows that like these vaccines don't stay in your system. You're injected and it does the job of, preparing your body for this disease, and then it's all gone, right?
Right. I mean, there's a social media app called Snapchat. I'm not a big social media person, but I'm aware that there's an app called Snapchat. And the way I understand it is that something pops up, it's there for 20 seconds or whatever time, and then it goes away and it's gone forever, right? That's how Snapchat works. That's how the mRNA works. The actual mRNA is a very unstable protein. It is not meant to be stable for long periods of time, because mRNA, the M for mRNA stands for messenger. And without getting too much biochemistry, your DNA kicks out the mRNA, which then goes to a ribosome, which is kind of like a 3D printer for a cell, and reads those instructions. And once those instructions are read, the mRNA is gone. So you have that mRNA in your system for minutes, maybe an hour, before it all dissipates. So those individuals who are saying, well, I don't know what's going to happen in 5 years, you're the person who's going to likely get COVID and then likely actually develop long COVID, or hopefully not, but you may also risk death as well.
What about this is like a remedial question, but why, because there are people that I know that ask this, why are hydroxychloroquine and ivermectin not appropriate prophylactics or treatment for COVID?
So that's actually a good question, and I like answering that question. All right. So ivermectin is an anti-parasitic medication, and hydroxychloroquine is an anti-parasitic medication. If you had a tricycle, would you put gasoline into it? Gasoline does not go into a tricycle. Okay, like it looks like it's got wheels. It's got a frame. You would put gasoline into a motorcycle. You wouldn't put gasoline into a tricycle, right? So why would you take anti-parasitic medications for an organism that causes an illness that's a virus? You want antivirals, right? You don't want antiparasitics. The antiparasitics completely different than antivirals. Antivirals are actually meant for viruses. So just like it doesn't make sense to put gasoline into a tricycle, it doesn't make sense to fight a virus with antiparasitic medications.
All right, that I think
you
that
can't
makes
get
sense.
more clear than that.
Right. What about people that have natural immunity? There was one person that said that her mother is very anti-vax, and her argument is that she had COVID a couple months ago, and so she shouldn't have to get the vaccine. What is,
right.
what?
So yeah, it's a good question, and I answer this question all the time as well. So a couple things. One is, when you get the vaccine, you have a standard response in terms of your immune response. We know how much immunity you're going to build. And what has been shown through clinical trials is that when you get the shot, you will build up a level of immunity that will protect you from severity of disease from COVID. Okay. Now, people who are quote unquote naturally immune, they got immunity from being infected. We don't know how much virus they got. Therefore, we don't know how much immunity they have built. So not all immunity is the same. Okay. So the issue here is that we want you to take the shot because we want you to have a standardized response to the vaccine. Now, that being said, it has been pretty clear that if you've had COVID and you've had one dose of the mRNA vaccine, you have the same immune response as somebody like myself who never had COVID, but had two vaccines, who had two doses. So, and the same thing is if for a booster. So if you were if you got COVID and then got two doses of the mRNA vaccine, you have a quote unquote booster immune response. The point is that multiple studies have shown that if you rely on natural immunity and are not vaccinated, the likelihood for you to get reinfected and possibly suffer the consequences, specifically mortality, is quite high.
If you don't mind, I'd just like to kind of respond to something the good doctor said that I think really resonates. If I go back a little bit, you mentioned about what it shows about our culture in the United States, and the fact that we have had the worst response by any like objective kind of measurement, whatever lens you want to view it through, whether it's a public health lens, a worker lens. There's really no dispute that the United States has totally botched this. Just a few days ago, I was listening to, what's the NPR econ? Marketplace. And they were talking about some of the fallout from the pandemic here as compared to Europe. And just as like a throwaway line, it was mentioned how, believe it or not, in most European countries, workers' salaries were subsidized throughout the entirety of the shutdown, quote unquote. And that's something that I think it's hard to undo what has been done. And this entire pandemic response was you could argue, sabotaged from the beginning by pitting so many people again. You're pitting people's interest as an individual, but also as a member of a community where our health is all tied together. And you're pitting that health interest versus your interest to simply survive in a market economy. And so, I think that really goes to the root of so many of the issues we're dealing with still now in 2021, about to be 2022, is that nearly 2 years ago, you basically forced folks, in many cases, to jeopardize their health in order to maintain their rent, their insurance, their groceries, and vice versa. You had people who were scared enough of their health that they were willing to leave their jobs, and we've seen that in record numbers. But the truth is, none of that had to happen. Those were all deliberate policy choices in the United States of America, the wealthiest economy on Earth in the history of this planet. It's not. I don't think it's that radical of an idea that we could have clearly subsidized workers' paychecks to get us through the worst of this pandemic. And had there been that sort of large-scale response, the sort of large-scale response that we saw our government provide during World War II, we know it's possible because we've done it before. That could have been such a game changer. And I just wonder what our statistics would look like now all this time later, had we done this thing even half-assed the right way, in February and March of 2020. And I don't know if there's anything for you to respond to there, but I just had to get that off my chest because I think it was so. It really resonated, and I'm glad you really hammered that home.
Yeah, no, I mean, why are we the wealthiest nation in the world or the history of this world? Is because we continually and consistently F over labor and workers in this country. Where did
in the
that
rest of the world?
Yeah, and the rest of the world.
Yeah.
Where did that wealth accumulation come from? It doesn't, we can't even think about what's going on right now. Listen, I am not a Democrat any way, shape, or form. I identify as a socialist. I'm a very open socialist. Okay, let's be very clear about this. But look at the Democratic Party right now in DC. There is a Voting Rights Act that's on the table. They need 51 votes to pass this, and they need to eliminate the filibuster. The politics of today are such that they can't even they can't even do the things that will prevent their demise. If that Voting Rights Act is not passed, we know what's going to happen. You live in a conservative state. I live in a conservative state. We are going to see more voting restriction laws come down the line more and more. And we still have Senator Sinema and Senator Manchin, who are opposing the filibuster reform for this Voting Rights Act. We can't do. You really expect that corporate America is going to respond to labor? No, not a chance in the world. They accumulated that wealth for a reason, right? They were able. My brother lives in Germany, and he tells me what it's like being a worker in Germany, right? He's a graphic artist and he's a musician in Germany, and he tells me about what his life is like there, right? And so, no. The politics of today is completely paralyzed. You can't even get Democrats to even do the right thing that will continue to keep them in office. You said
their own self-preservation cannot even be fulfilled in opposition to
100%. Right. So when you say, look at how the voters are dying, right? They're killing off their voters, right? Republicans are basically killing off their voters, right? That doesn't seem smart at all. But when you look at the Democratic Party, they're not even able to preserve, if you and I were in office, we'd be running to get that Voting Rights Act in place, so that we would continue to actually be in office. Complete self-preservation, but they can't even do that. And let's just be very clear. President Biden is the worst president ever. Remember what he said? Remember why we were supposed to vote for him? We were supposed to vote for President Biden because he was going to get Republicans to vote with him. Remember when he said, I'm going to get Republicans to vote with me? He can't even get Democrats to vote with him. Okay. Right, yeah. So no, this is a good thing.
It's a good thing that the primary voters chose to be so realistic. Right. Yeah. And be pragmatic and go with Joe Biden. Those of us who were supporting Bernie were just pie in the sky, and nothing was going to get done. And I sit here a year later wondering just what the hell has been done. What has been done? Because I'm seeing very little. And, the paralysis in D.C. has not changed a bit, as far as I can tell, even with, a right-wing Democrat president, even with the Democratic Party controlling both chambers. There's no movement. And for me personally...
Look what passed. Mm-hmm. What passed was the corporate-dominated Build Back Better, right? The 1.5 trillion. The hard infrastructure, which was basically a giveaway to corporate America. Look what didn't pass, right? What didn't pass was the so-called soft infrastructure, which was going to help you and I. That was going to make
and by
our
soft
lives
they mean human
better.
Beings, right? Yes. I think we need to be clear about that. And I can speak, for my family and what we are facing, and it's what millions of other families are facing, which is on December 15th, we received our last deposit for having a child. I got $250 put in my bank account, and that is the last time that's going to happen. And barring some monumental shift in D.C., which looks, less and less likely every day we go. And at the same time, I have to prepare for my student loan payments to resume next month. So that's a pretty big swing for me, but it's not even, dropping the bucket compared to what many families are facing, where, you have perhaps $500 deposit being cut off, and now looking at, a $400 or $500 monthly student loan bill, and looking at about $1,000 swing in your budget. That's huge. Right as this Omicron variant is about to really kick some ass based on what you've been describing, because I think, as you pointed out, that it's not necessarily right now that we're going to see how bad it is. It's going to be a month from now, after everyone's congregated, after it's really, really spread. And, I think any sort of, major shutdowns, quote unquote, like we experienced back in the early days, I find that highly unlikely, because they've pretty much proven they don't give a shit. And there's no amount of death that's really going to stop them from closing the Walmarts and the ball games. But that's just going to be quite a crisis in our across our economy and across our society, to have a resurgent pandemic right at the time that people's vital lifelines for families are being cut off, and now you're adding in those student loans. Sally Mae's calling you back. She's a scorned lover, and she hadn't forgot about you, and she will be calling you come February, wanting her money back. It's just a perfect storm.
Yeah, no, and it's such a good point too. If you think about it, those payments lifted half, it relieved poverty in 50% of childhood Americans.
Poverty in half. Yeah,
it cut. Now that begs two questions. One is, well, if that cut poverty in half, then we can cut poverty 100%. Right. Like, we can do it. And then two, why are you reversing it? Because you're going to push people back in poverty. And remember, it's because they don't care. The elite in this country do not care about us. And let's be very, very clear about it. They have shown it. Climate change, gun violence, coronavirus, they do not care for ordinary workers like us. And remember, fighting with Biden and driving with Biden and all that stuff. And Biden's a Scranton guy and he's a union guy, whatever. Where's the PRO Act? Let's go. It was just it was same thing with Obama. I'm going to put on a pair of comfortable walking shoes and hit the picket lines. Right. And we never saw those comfortable walking shoes, and we never saw him out on a picket line. Right. So where are the elites do not care for us, and they do not care for labor. But I will say this. I am somewhat slightly inspired and feel, I'm terribly inspired, but I feel slightly optimistic with the strikes that we're seeing right now, and that we're seeing labor really rise up. I mean, obviously what happened with Kellogg was devastating, right? But I am inspired with what labor is doing right now, and what with this so-called Great Resignation. And so hopefully people will start to realize that we have one thing to fight against the elites. And that is, if we coalesce and we withhold our labor, that is our strength. This is why they crush unions. This is why they don't want unions to be around. This is why they constantly are embattling us. Vaccines, abortions, climate change, whatever we can do to help split people, they will do, because they don't want us to coalesce. Because when we coalesce, we will always beat the elites. We will always beat corporate America. So we have to find ways, but we are deeply divided at this point. And if we can't even agree on wearing masks, and if we can't agree on vaccines, I strongly fear for what the future of this country looks like, because they have guns, and they have a lot of guns. and they have a lot of ammunition. And we are starting to see people like Gosart and Boebert and Cawthorn and all of these crazies are starting to call for quote unquote Second Amendment solutions. And you know what that is. Like, that's just code for go out and start shooting the liberals.
Right. Yeah, well, I mean, and Rittenhouse is being, I mean, he's being turned into a hero. I mean, oh my God. But anyway, we're gonna go. Yeah,
sorry to get us off track on the big picture, Jacob. But I do know we have a couple specific COVID vaccine questions.
There was a good transition there from the masks and the vaccines to the next question. So I'll tell you my plans, and you can tell me how much you're judging me. So I'm planning on going to a concert tonight in Birmingham. That is going to be indoors, but if there is a vaccine,
I'm going to judge you on who you're going to go see.
I'm going to see Lee Baines. Lee Baines and the Glory Fires. So he's good. Yeah. Going to see Lee Baines and the Glory Fires, but there you do have to be vaccinated to get in the door. And I don't know if masks are mandatory. I'll probably not, because there's a vaccine mandate. Like, what are as an infectious disease specialist? Sure. Like, what is your opinion on? Yeah.
Right, and I'm a musician as well. So I've been playing. So I've been, I live in New Orleans. I gig regularly. I think, and last night, my wife works for City Hall. We went to a mayor's Christmas party. That's probably the last time I'm going to get into a room of people. Everybody had to be vaccinated to get in. Masking was optional. Last night was probably the last time I'm going to probably go into a group of people until Omicron passes. So if you wanted to go out tonight and do a concert, that's great. We canceled any gigs at bars moving forward, although vaccines are required, and they're really good with checking vaccine status before entering a bar here in New Orleans. But we've canceled, and we haven't booked any shows for the next 6 weeks. The band, they're like, oh, well, we have an infectious diseases expert with us. Let's check with him and see what he says. And when I say, we're all a bunch of, 50-year-old middle-aged dudes, with hypertension and slightly overweight and all that stuff. So we're all, and even though we're all boosted, we're very, very cognizant. So I would, my wife and I usually travel for the holidays. We canceled all our plans. We're not traveling. Like I said, last night was probably the last time I'm going to step into a room with people. We don't go to restaurants. We don't go to bars. And again, I've stopped playing any gigs right now until after Omicron passes. Omicron is going to burn very, very brightly. And it's going to probably kind of like Delta, live fast, die young. So I would get in your last pre-COVID, days, do whatever it is that you need to do, and then start kind of getting back into a 2020, 2021 mentality.
So you think New Year's Eve is probably, you would be hesitant to have a good time or go out and party
I would experience New Year's Eve outdoors.
Okay.
We're not going to do anything indoors with large groups of people moving forward.
Okay. What about the Omicron specifically? There's I haven't looked too much into it, but I have read that Omicron is potentially less deadly than Delta or Alpha or wild type. What's the truth value of that claim?
So there was a great study that just came out a couple days ago that helps explain why Omicron is less virulent. The word that you're looking for there is called virulent. So virulence or virulent. Virulent means how severe a disease is. And so what this study out of Hong Kong showed was what they are able to do. This research group is very famous for testing new pathogens against human tissue. So what they did is they took human tissue from the bronchi. So that's the top part of your lung. So when you take the first breath, when you breathe, it goes right into the bronchi, and then the bronchi splits and before it gets into the lungs. So the bronchi it's the long tube before it gets into the lungs. When they looked at tissue with bronchial tissue versus deep lung tissue, what they found was that the virus was, as I mentioned earlier, 70 times more active in bronchial tissue than Delta, right? So what this explains is why it's so infectious. But the second thing that they found was that it is actually the ability for it to grow in deep lung tissue is actually retarded. It's actually not, it does not grow well in deep lung tissue. So this helps to explain why clinically what we're seeing is that the virus is incredibly infectious, but very likely less virulent. So we are seeing, thankfully, because if this virus was highly infectious and highly deadly like Delta, oh boy, I don't think that listen, I work in hospitals. We're tired. This has been 2 years. We're tired. And we're frustrated. We're frustrated because everybody that we see, right, is every time I see somebody, they're unvaccinated for COVID and they're in the COVID units or in the ICU, right? It's always one of two things. I'm not anti-vax. I'm like, why didn't you get vaccinated then? I was just waiting. Okay, well, now here you are. And then they're always going to ask you this. Well, can I get vaccinated now? No, it doesn't work like that. You have COVID. Like the whole point is to prevent actually getting COVID. So we're very, very, very tired. Doctors are frustrated. Nurses are frustrated. And this is what you're seeing. So fortunately, what we are seeing, and now I'm going to speculate, if you don't mind me, give me a minute and let me kind of explain what the COVID landscape is like right now. So in 1918, we had the influenza. I'm sure you've all are well aware of that. Now we, 200 and some odd years later, are still living in a post-influenza 1918 influenza era. The virus from 1918 still circulates today. And if you get a flu shot every year, that flu shot that you're getting has 1918 virus in it. So we're still living in post-1918 pandemic flu. We don't know it. You don't see it. People like me will be the ones that tell you about it. But what happened was that over time, generation after generation after generation. So we're talking, I'm going to define a generation for 20 years, generation after generation after generation, that virus becomes less virulent, but it's still going to stay. Now, what we've seen with coronavirus is that each variant has become more infectious and more virulent. Now, we haven't seen that before. Usually viruses become more infectious or they become more virulent, but they never become more infectious and more virulent. This is the first time that we've ever seen a virus become more infectious and more virulent. And I hope, this is me speculating, me crossing my fingers, crossing my toes, that I think what we're going to start to see is that Omicron is going to start the beginning of the virus becoming more infectious and less virulent. And what the virus is ultimately going to evolve into is learning how to live with humans without killing the host. So possibly what we're going to see is that this virus is going to eventually settle down. We're going to have coronavirus for the rest of our lives, right? And the lives of our generation after generation after generation, but it'll be more like the common cold. It'll be more like influenza. And that's what I'm hoping. Now, this is our first virus, like our first variant that's less virulent. So we need to wait for 2 or 3 more before we can definitively make those statements. But I do believe, and I'm hopeful that we will move into a period where we will see less virulence with this virus as it evolves into a human host.
Do you think that as the case rates increase for Omicron, that we will actually see death rates decrease when compared to similar? You think that it's less virulent, but it's still virulent enough that Okay.
Yes.
I see.
Because because of the math, because you're going to knock off more people, because you're seeing such high levels of infectiousness, you're going to see increases in mortality, but you're going to see less severity of disease overall. So if you look at, I check the New York Times every morning, and I look at their maps and their graphs. We are seeing increases in both mortality and hospitalizations right now. Now, I don't know if that's Delta or Omicron. I think it's probably still Delta, but we will see something shift when Omicron really hits the U.S. heavy duty. But I think that overall there is going to be less virulence. Now, remember, who is Omicron going to affect? It's going to affect those that are most are unvaccinated. It's going to hit those people who had COVID in the past and are unvaccinated, because reinfection with Omicron is almost certainly a thing. Cornell University this week shut down almost 900 cases of students, and they were all fully vaccinated. They had 900 cases. So we're going to see those people who are at highest risk: elderly, obesity, pregnant women, that sort of stuff.
So that's a good, the next question that we had came from Ben. Actually, he's he's the owner of Spice Radio here, and he was wondering, since we don't currently have, the vaccine numbers that we need, what will the unvaccinated population eventually diminish from death and sickness, or are we going to be having a huge wave of cases among the unvaccinated every single year?
Yeah, so that's a really, really good question. And let me first say that nobody has an answer, because you're asking me to predict the future.
Right.
So, but I've been sitting here predicting the future, so it's a fair question to ask, right? That one I don't know, except to say that I think yes. We will see. There's a lot of human wood left to burn, and that human wood are those people who are unvaccinated or vaccinated but not yet boosted. So if you are unvaccinated, completely unvaccinated, you have the likelihood of you getting Omicron is incredibly high. The likelihood of you going on to get long COVID is incredibly high, and the likelihood, especially if you fall into the category of being obese, of having chronic health conditions, of being elderly — we're defining elderly over the age of 65. If you fall into any of those categories, the likelihood of severity disease is very, very high. And what we will see moving forward, and and I think that the owner of the radio station asked a great question: will we continue to see COVID to be a pandemic of those that are unvaccinated? Without question, the answer is absolutely yes.
Can I say something there? Obviously, not being an epidemiologist like yourself, but my wheels are turning, and I'm thinking, okay, if we have this large chunk of the population here domestically that's unvaccinated primarily by choice, not entirely. Of course, abroad, we have entire regions that are largely unvaccinated primarily due to access. And, this is a broader issue of imperialism and intellectual copyrights, etc. But my point being, okay, so we've got this chunk of folks here and there, they're unvaccinated, and, it's going to be able to spread much more through them. It's going to take much more of them down, obviously. But what I'm wondering, and what it looks like to me, is that the more there's that group in which the virus can incubate and then create new variants, is that something that we have to be concerned about, that as long as there's this rump of the population basically that is sort of opening themselves up to coronavirus, that the danger is maybe the next Omicron is just as infectious but much more deadly, perhaps. Does that make sense? Because I'm not a science person. I don't really know exactly what I'm talking about.
You're asking the 100% perfect question. So this is something that I get on my soapbox and yell about all the time, is that we have not allowed this vaccine to be distributed and manufactured around the world. Who created this vaccine? The U.S. government. Who paid for that? Our taxes. But it is a classic American move, because remember, the business of America is business. And so if at any time the American government can hand over things to corporate America and hurt itself in the process, they will do that, right? That's what we do. Like, for example, Medicare Part D is basically allows for big pharma to charge anything it wants to the American government, and they cannot by law negotiate prices. That was part of what Build Back Better was to help, negotiate prices, and we can't do it. So what did we do? So the American government basically, the NIH invented what became the Moderna vaccine, right? We turned around and gave it to this company, or sold it to the company Moderna. We could have negotiated, here, you can make your first $20 billion, but then we will also then at that time release the intellectual property of it and allow other countries to continue, to use the vaccine. But we did not do that. So what's going to happen? There's no question in my mind. I thought of it, and I'm just a humble epidemiologist living in New Orleans, Louisiana, right? There's no question that very, very, very smart scientists that work at the Moderna or Pfizer or what have you, they knew good and well that variants are going to continue to pop off all over the world. They know, and they still withheld it. And this goes back to the overall theme of what we've been talking about, is that we as Americans need to recognize, and we need to wake up, right, from this gaslighting kind of dream that we live in, that we're the best and we're the greatest and that we care for everybody and human rights and social justice and all of this crap, because that's, quite frankly, that's BS. And we know that. We should have been out front vaccinating the globe, right? If we really cared for people, because we know there's a number of studies that show that it's the immunosuppressed who are creating the variants. And this Omicron is thought to have originated from somebody who has HIV, has end-stage HIV that's not treated. I'm an HIV provider. I do HIV medicine. That's my specialty. And the fact that, and I know the immunosuppression you have when you have AIDS, we will refer to that as AIDS. And I know what that immunosuppression is like. And so the fact that we have people who are unvaccinated in this, think about this. And the other thing too, the person who asked the question, is your name Adam? I can't see you.
Yeah. Sorry, I'm behind the scenes today.
No. You said something that I really want to highlight, which is that think about from the perspective of an un-American, right? So let's look at somebody in Africa or somebody in the Middle East or what have you. They can't get vaccinated. Mm-hmm. They don't have access to vaccines. Less than 2% of Africa as a continent has been vaccinated, but yet all the clinical trials happened in Africa. Think about that. And that goes back to the imperialism that you were talking about a moment ago. But imagine the hubris they think about us when they're like, oh, there's Americans that are not choosing to get vaccinated, and we're desperate to be vaccinated. It is so, the hubris of the American experiment is just beyond. It just leaves me scratching my head, And so if we want to see this pandemic go away, we would vaccinate the globe. We would eliminate this TRIPS waiver. And we would move forward by lifting the intellectual property. During the early 2000s, the so-called aughts, HIV was a devastating disease in Thailand, in India, in Brazil. right? All three of those countries are massive biotech countries. And what those three countries did was just basically take the HIV medications that were coming out of America, and they just, patent or not, they were like, screw it, we're going to make our own generics of it. And you had the various companies that threatened, they sued these countries, but then eventually dialed back because they realized that was a bad look for them. And now you don't hear about HIV in Brazil or in India or in Thailand as we did in the early aughts. You know why? Because those governments actually came up with those generics, and that's how they're managing HIV in those countries. And the same thing needs to happen now. And until it happens, we're going to.
Yeah, well, the same thing needs to happen now. Even like we were talking about earlier, even just the self-preservation, like the system is unable to even self-preserve. Like it would be 100%. Good for us
100%.
If we
100%.
vaccinated the whole world. I mean,
100%.
What about information on the vaccine for children under 6? What's the latest there?
So that I'm an adult doctor, and so I'm not 100% up on pediatric vaccinations. We do know that they're safe, but quite frankly, the one thing I will say is that the Omicron variant has seen an increase in pediatric hospitalizations by 20% in South Africa. Wow. So under the age of 18, there has been an increase in 20%. So this virus may disproportionately affect the youngest amongst us. But I am very, very sorry to say that I'm not a pediatric doctor, and I don't focus 100% on
Sure.
peds. I focus a little bit more on the larger and the adult population. So I can't answer with the same level of authenticity that I can with your other questions.
Sure. What about at-home testing for family gatherings? We had one question that
it's a great question. Yep, and we do it ourselves here at the Dery and Elliott household. So the Bionex test is $23 at a pharmacy. There's 2 tests in them. They're somewhat difficult. You have to kind of read the instructions. Don't just open the box. But those are antigen testing. I think that if you're going to get together for holidays, I think it's a good idea that everybody should be boosted and would take an antigen test, and that they can show that they're negative. I think that if you did that, I think that your holiday gathering would be safe. Even if you weren't boosted, if you were vaccinated, and if you're not vaccinated at all, and I know that we're talking to your audience is in Alabama and is largely a conservative audience. If you're completely unvaccinated, I think that, and you're going to get together with other people for the holidays, New Year's, I think that the Bionex test is sufficient enough to if everybody's negative, that you should feel comfortable gathering in that group environment.
Okay.
It's a great question. I'm glad you asked.
What about mixing and matching for the boosters?
That's a great idea. Mix and match. I got boosted with this. I got Moderna, and then it just happened that I got a third Moderna dose. The studies have shown that whether you mix or match, the level of immunity is the same.
Gotcha.
Can I
including Johnson & Johnson. So if you got a Johnson & Johnson and then you got an mRNA vaccine, either one, I would avoid getting a second Johnson & Johnson vaccine. I would recommend that if you got a Johnson & Johnson, only 5% of America got Johnson & Johnson. But if you did get a Johnson & Johnson vaccine, I would recommend getting boosted with an mRNA vaccine, and it doesn't matter which one you get.
Thank you. That was my question. I'm one of the strange 5% that ended up with the J&J, and you never hear discussions publicly about, which shot are you supposed to get? Does it matter which shot you get? So thank you for saying that. You answered my question, and I'm sure I can't be the only one.
Right. I think that was we had one more question. This is the last one. What's the latest information on masking? Is that effective? How should we mask? When should we mask, etc.?
The science is very, very clear. Here's my phone, guys. I'm going to show you my phone, right? Here's my phone. What were to happen if I were to let go of it? Right? It's going to fall to the center of the earth. Okay. And a thing called gravity. Okay. So masking and the science behind masking is sufficient. And it is clear that masking prevents the transmission of the virus, and it also prevents the acquisition of the virus. When I mask with a surgical mask, and then I usually wear a cloth mask over it. That's just my personal preference. A KN95 is fine. When I travel, so I've had to travel and fly, I usually will triple mask. I'll wear a cloth. I will wear a surgical mask, a KN95 or an N95, and then a cloth mask over it. So I think it's important. Masking is important. I think that we're going to start to see more masking moving forward, especially as Omicron approaches us.
Support for the Valley Labor Report comes from the International Federation of Professional and Technical Engineers Union. Learn more by visiting www.ifpte.org.